The snow had started to fall thicker than expected, turning the entire street into a white blur. David Miller's driver had pulled over, hazard lights blinking against the thickening curtain of frost. They were stuck. The highway cameras were down, and the radio station crackled with road closure. Warnings. Inside the back seat of his luxury car, David tapped impatiently at his phone, attempting to reschedule a board meeting. The heater buzzed quietly as condensation began creeping up the windows. And then, just for a second, he saw movement outside, something small, brownish in contrast to the snow. He leaned forward, narrowed his eyes, and stared through the windshield. That's when he saw the boy. The child couldn't have been older than 10. Thin, ragged clothes clung to his frail body, and he was barefoot. But what hit David harder than anything was what the boy was carrying. Bundled in, makeshift blankets, one yellow, one blue, one off-white, were 3 newborn babies, one in each arm and another cradled precariously against his chest, their tiny knitted caps doing little to shield them from the storm. The boy's face wasn't crying, but it looked broken, as if whatever tears he had were already spent. His lips were blue. His legs trembled under the weight. But he wasn't asking for help. He wasn't running. He was just standing. David didn't think. He opened the door and stepped out into the storm, the cold slicing into his tailored coat. "Hey, kid!" he shouted, trying to be heard over the wind. The boy flinched but didn't move. David approached slowly, palms open, like approaching a wild animal. "It's okay. I'm not gonna hurt you," he said, more gently this time. As he got closer, he saw the babies' chests moving, shallow and uneven. One of them let out a small cry. David's chest tightened. The boy looked up at him then, eyes sunken but full of something he couldn't quite place. Not fear, not trust either, just desperation. "Are you alone?" David asked. The boy didn't speak. He shifted his weight, struggling to keep the babies close to his body. David noticed, now that his hands were red, almost raw from the cold. "We need to get them warm," he said, more to himself than the boy. Without waiting for a reply, he took off his coat and draped it around the boy's back, gently guiding him toward the car. The driver opened the door, stunned by the sight. "Sir, what the—" "Just help me," David snapped. The boy hesitated before stepping in, glancing once behind him as if expecting someone to stop him. But there was only white, snow, and silence. Inside the car, the heater blasted at full power. David wrapped the coat tighter around the boy and helped him. Settle the babies into the seat. One of them let out a dry cough. David's assistant on speakerphone was still talking logistics. He ended the call without a word. Turning to the boy, he tried again. "What's your name?" A pause, then a whisper. "Ethan. Ethan, where are your parents?" Another. In pause, the boy looked down at the babies. "They're gone," he muttered. His voice was flat, no tremor, no emotion, just a fact. David felt something unfamiliar coil in his stomach. He'd faced CEOs, courtrooms, Wall Street takeovers, but this felt bigger. Realer. The snow outside was getting heavier. Visibility was dropping fast. David's phone buzzed again, his housekeeper checking in. "Tell her we're coming back," he told his driver. The boy, Ethan, was silent, arms wrapped tight around the babies, even as they rested in his lap. "You don't have to be afraid," David said, voice low. Ethan shook his head. "I'm not afraid for me." The words didn't make sense yet, but the tone chilled him more than the weather. David couldn't take his eyes off the boy. Every move, every stillness had weight. There was a story here, a dark one, and he had just stepped into the middle of it. They arrived. At the mansion nearly an hour later, the staff rushed to open the doors, puzzled by the sudden emergency. David carried one of the babies himself, an action that surprised even him. The warmth inside felt surreal after the cold outside. He ordered warm towels, baby formula, dry clothes. The boy stood in the entryway, holding two of the babies now, unsure if he was allowed to step further. "This is your home for now," David said. Ethan didn't respond. His eyes darted around, taking in the grand staircases, the polished floors, the warmth, the chandeliers. He didn't seem impressed, only confused, as if none of it mattered. Later that night, David stood at his bedroom window, staring out at the snow-covered grounds. The storm had passed, but his thoughts hadn't settled. He kept replaying the moment, the boy's eyes, the baby's shallow breaths, the weight of it all. He should call someone, the police, a hospital, but something about Ethan's expression, about the way he held those children, made him hesitate. This wasn't a random encounter. It didn't feel like chance. It felt like the beginning of something. Maybe a trap. Maybe fate. He didn't believe in fate, but he also didn't believe in kids wandering barefoot in blizzards with infants in their arms. As the grandfather clock struck midnight, David walked down the hallway, past guest rooms and storage wings, until he reached the one room he hadn't used in years, the nursery. It had belonged to his sister once. Now, it stood frozen in time, dust on the crib, a faded mobile hanging still. He opened the door, the creak of it sounding louder than it should. And there they were, Ethan curled up in the corner chair, two babies nestled against him, one in a cradle beside. His eyes were closed, but his arms were locked. In place, holding them tightly even in sleep. David stared for a long moment before closing the door gently behind him. The night was quiet now, but David's mind was anything but. There were questions pounding at the door of his logic. Who was Ethan? Where did the babies come from? Why had he been alone? And perhaps more importantly, why did David feel like none of this was a coincidence? In all his years of business, he had always trusted data. But right now, standing in the dark of his own house, there was only one thing he trusted. That boy needed him, and something told him he might need Ethan just as much. The next morning, sunlight struggled through the frost-coated windows, casting a pale glow over the mansion's interior. David hadn't slept. He sat in the kitchen, staring blankly at the untouched cup of coffee on the marble counter. His assistant, Lauren, had arrived early, ready to discuss the quarterly earnings call. She took one look at David and paused. "You look like hell," she muttered. David didn't respond. His mind was locked on what he had witnessed the night before. Ethan, the three babies, that haunted look on the boy's face, the kind of look that said he'd already seen too much. For someone his age, it gnawed at him. Logic told him to call Child Protective Services. Instinct told him not yet. The house was quiet, but the silence didn't bring peace. It intensified the weight of the unknown. Eventually, David stood and walked toward the nursery. He opened the door, slowly. Ethan was awake, but he didn't move. He sat in the chair, staring ahead, while gently rocking one of the babies. The other two lay swaddled beside him, breathing softly. David stepped inside, crouched to eye level. "Morning," he said quietly. Ethan blinked but didn't respond. David tried again. "You sleep okay?" A nod, small and mechanical. "They kept warm," Ethan whispered, eyes still fixed on the baby. His voice was barely audible, yet every word felt carved from something sharp. This wasn't just a quiet kid. This was a kid suppressing something heavy. David sat on the floor, arms resting on his knees. He didn't want to scare the boy. "Ethan, I need to know what happened," he said. "You don't have to tell me everything, just where are your parents? The baby's parents." The boy finally looked at him. His eyes were glassy but not wet. "They're not mine," he said. "I mean, not really." David leaned in slightly. "What do you mean?" Ethan took a long breath. "They were left with me. Before she left. She said she was coming back, but it's been 3 days." David's pulse ticked up. Who's she? Your mum? Ethan shook his head. My sister. David's stomach dropped a little. What's her name? Abby, Ethan replied. She told me to stay quiet, said she had to fix something and she'd be back before the snow. David pressed further. Where were you staying? Do you remember the address? Ethan shrugged. It was behind a building, near the old train yard. I don't know the name. David took note. That area had been condemned for years. How old is Abby? 17, Ethan said. She's been taking care of us since our mom disappeared. Then one day, these babies just showed up. She told me we had to protect them. David stared. None of this made sense. It was a story patched together with fear, memory, and something darker. Lauren entered, whispering not to interrupt, but David waved her in. Can you get me a map of the industrial zone near the rail yards? She nodded and disappeared. David turned back to Ethan. Do you know where the babies came from? Who they belong to? Ethan tensed. I think they're hers. Abby's friend, maybe. I don't know. She just said they couldn't be alone, that someone was looking for them. She made me promise I wouldn't let them go. His voice cracked a little now. David reached over, not touching him, but close. You did good, Ethan. You kept them alive, but now I need to know who's after them. Ethan said nothing. He looked down at the baby again. I don't know their names, he whispered. Abby didn't say. David leaned back, mind racing. He had taken in 4 unknown minors overnight, one of whom was possibly involved in something criminal without realizing it. His legal team would lose their minds, but there was no way he was turning them over to a system that wouldn't ask the right questions. He'd seen too many cases buried in bureaucracy. These kids needed answers, not abandonment. And Ethan needed someone to believe him before the world labeled him a liar or worse. Later that afternoon, David made calls, quietly. He avoided government channels, starting instead with private investigators and local emergency rooms. No reports of missing infants, no Amber Alerts, but one ER nurse he knew mentioned something strange. A teen girl had come in days ago asking for help, then ran off when questioned. She didn't leave a name, but she had a cut on her hand and seemed frantic. Where was this? David asked. Near the rail yard, the nurse replied. That was enough for him. There was a trail. He just needed to follow it before it went cold. He didn't tell Ethan what he'd learned yet, not until he was sure. That night, David set up a temporary crib system in the guest bedroom closest to his own. Ethan insisted on staying in the same room as the babies. They cry less if I'm near, he said. David watched him handle them, gently, confidently. No 10-year-old should be that used to the needs of newborns. Something about that broke him. When he tried to help with feeding, Ethan flinched, not because he was afraid of David, but as if he'd forgotten what it felt like to have help. David backed off. You're not alone in this anymore, he said softly. Ethan gave a tiny nod, not acceptance, just acknowledgement. Before bed, David stood alone in his office, reviewing old security footage from his father's estate records. Something about Ethan nagged at his memory. There was familiarity in the shape of his face, the tone of his voice. He pulled up archived files from years back, employees, guests, charity contacts. Nothing matched directly. But then, a photo caught his eye. A Christmas party. One of the former housekeepers in the background, holding a baby. The woman looked eerily like Ethan. Same eyes, same jawline. Abigail, David muttered. He zoomed in. The woman had worked there, under a different name. This wasn't random. This was coming full circle. David sat back, overwhelmed. There were too many unknowns, too many secrets buried beneath the snow of the past. But one thing was clear. Ethan and those babies weren't just strays in a storm. They were part of something bigger, something that had crossed paths with his world before. And now, for better or worse, their survival depended on him. Not as a billionaire, not as a businessman, but as a man who couldn't walk away anymore, not this time. The next morning arrived with a deceptive stillness, the kind of silence that felt too perfect, like the world was holding its breath. David found himself waking earlier than usual, long before the mansion stirred to life. He stepped into the hallway and moved toward the guest room where Ethan had spent the night with the babies. Slowly, he opened the door. Inside, the room was dim, the soft golden light of sunrise slipping through the curtains. Ethan was awake, sitting on the floor, one leg crossed under the other, gently feeding the smallest of the three infants. The boy didn't look up as David entered. He was focused, calm, movements careful. There was something methodical in the way he cared for them, repetition, born from necessity, not training. David watched for a moment before kneeling down. "You ever been shown how to do that?" he asked softly. Ethan shook his head. "I watched." "Abby," he said. "Then I had to figure the rest out." David nodded, taking a mental note. He wanted to understand this boy more, not just the events, but the world that had shaped him. "Can you tell me more about where you lived before? What was it like?" Ethan paused, then set the bottle down gently, shifting the baby into a soft cradle made from folded blankets. "It was small," he said. "We lived in a trailer behind a junkyard. It smelled like oil and old food, but it was ours. Abby always said it wasn't forever. She said we were just passing through." He continued, his voice low but steady. "She worked nights at a diner. I stayed with her friends sometimes, but mostly I watched the place. We didn't have much, but Abby tried to make it feel like a home. She put stickers on the fridge and used to sing to me when the power went out. We had a rule, one good thing every day, even if it was dumb, like finding a coin or getting an extra ketchup packet. It made us feel like we were still winning even if we weren't." David listened, absorbing every word, every detail. The boy's recollections weren't polished. They were raw, honest, like snapshots from a life lived in survival mode. Ethan looked toward the window, as if trying to summon a memory. "Then she met a girl," he added. "I don't know her name, just that they started talking a lot, and one day she brought her home. She was scared, like real scared. Abby told me to stay in the back room. I heard them fighting, whispering. The girl was crying. A few days later, the babies showed up." David's heartbeat slowed. "So the babies, they came from that girl?" Ethan nodded slowly. "I think so. Abby wouldn't say. She just told me they were special and that we had to take care of them. She looked different after that, like she was always watching the door, like someone was coming." David stood and paced slowly, thinking. He turned to Ethan again. "What about school? Did you go?" Ethan gave a small laugh, dry, bitter. "Once, a guy came by to talk about enrollment, but Abby said it wasn't safe, said we couldn't. Be on the grid. I didn't ask what that meant. She just looked scared, and I believed her." David sat again. He didn't want to push too far, too fast, but the pieces were starting to form a shape. An image of someone running, hiding, and dragging her little brother along because there was no one else. "Do you remember anything else? About the girl who brought the babies?" Ethan bit his lip, thinking. She had a scar on her wrist, and she smelled like lemon soap. They spent most of the morning like that. David asking questions carefully, Ethan answering only what he felt sure about. Each sentence offered another crack into the world they'd come from. David was struck by how little emotion the boy used when talking. Not because he didn't care, but because he had learned to bury it. Every time Ethan mentioned Abby, his voice tightened just a little. David realized this boy was holding on to the only thread of stability he'd ever known, and now she was missing. He needed answers, but more importantly, Ethan needed hope, a reason to believe someone was still coming for them, or at least that they weren't truly alone anymore. Later that afternoon, David called in a pediatric specialist to examine the babies discreetly. He instructed his staff to say nothing outside the mansion. As the doctor conducted a quiet assessment, Ethan stayed close, eyes tracking every movement. When the doctor noted mild dehydration and signs of prolonged exposure in the infants, David's concern deepened. "They need proper care, but they're stable," the doctor said. "Whatever he's been doing, it kept them alive." That struck David. This wasn't just a kid doing his best. This was a boy who'd already taken on more responsibility than most adults ever would. And he was still standing, barely. That evening, David brought Ethan a warm meal, set it on the edge of the bed, and sat across from him. "Why didn't you go to someone? A neighbor? Police?" Ethan pushed food around with his fork before answering. "Because we tried once, a long time ago. When our mom disappeared, we told someone, but they didn't listen. And the next day, a man showed up asking questions Abby didn't like. After that, she said, 'We handle things ourselves.'" David closed his eyes for a moment. The system had failed him, again and again. And now, here he was, sitting in a billionaire's mansion, still unsure if this place was any safer. David went to his study that night and opened an old chest of family records. Inside, letters and files from decades past, some from when his father ran the estate. He dug through, trying to connect any detail Ethan had shared. Then he found a note, dated 15 years ago. Housekeeping application from a woman named Catherine Harper. Her emergency contact was Abigail Harper, age 2. The surname matched. Could it be? He scanned the address, an old rental near the same train yard Ethan mentioned. David's heart pounded. It wasn't just coincidence. The Harper family had crossed paths with his own, and maybe, just maybe, this child and those babies were tangled in a history that wasn't over. The thought chilled him. If his father had known about them, why hadn't he said anything? What was buried in the silence of that past? As David stared at the old file, he realized he had a choice. He could pretend this was an accident, an odd turn of fate that would pass, or he could face what was unraveling in front of him. This wasn't just a story about rescue, it was about responsibility. And something deep in his gut told him this family wasn't done with his yet. The knock on the front door came just past midnight, sharp, deliberate but not frantic, the kind of knock that didn't ask permission. It announced presence. David had been in his study, flipping through old estate blueprints, trying to piece together any trace of the Harper name in his father's legacy. The sudden sound cut through the silence like a scalpel. He froze for a moment, then moved quickly but not without caution. His home was guarded discreetly, cameras at every entry point. But something about this moment felt off. He pulled up the live feed from the security monitor. Nothing. Just snow, just night, and then another knock, this time louder. He descended the stairs slowly, steps deliberate, almost rehearsed. At the foyer, one of the night staff stood stiffly by the door, clearly rattled. "There's no one on the camera, sir," she said, eyes wide, "but I heard it." A 2. David looked at the heavy oak door, then at the monitor on the wall beside it. Still nothing. No movement, no shadow, just wind-swirling snow in the porch light. He opened the door himself, hand steady. The porch was empty, no footprints, no note, nothing. Just the cold, biting and endless. He closed the door, bolted it, and turned to the staff member. "Say nothing to the boy," he said firmly. "He doesn't need to know." But Ethan already did. David found him sitting in the hallway upstairs, eyes locked on the front door from the top of the staircase. He didn't speak when David approached. He didn't blink either, just sat there, knees pulled to his chest, bare feet against the hardwood floor. David crouched beside him. "You heard it too?" he asked. Ethan nodded slowly. "She used to knock like that," he whispered. "Abby, when she came home late." His voice broke on the last word. David's stomach dropped. "You think she was here?" Ethan didn't answer. He just looked toward the door like a ghost was still standing there. The next morning, David ordered a complete sweep of the estate grounds. He brought in private security, avoided calling law enforcement. He didn't trust the bureaucracy, not with Ethan's fear, not with the delicate balance they'd barely built over the past few days. Meanwhile, Ethan didn't speak much. He hovered close to the babies, barely touching food, responding only in nods. David tried to distract him with small tasks, helping fold blankets, organizing baby supplies, but the boy's mind was elsewhere. He was watching, listening, waiting. That's when David realized something. Ethan wasn't just scared Abby wouldn't return. He was scared someone else might come instead. By early afternoon, one of the security men reported faint boot prints, leading away from the property, toward the tree line behind the estate, too faint to follow far, too perfect to be natural. David reviewed the perimeter footage again. At exactly 12:03 a.m., a 30-second glitch in camera 4, a complete blackout. "Sabotage?" he asked. The technician nodded. "Manual from inside." That froze David in place. Inside, his staff was vetted, loyal, but loyalty had limits when fear or money entered the equation. He called Lauren into his office. "Audit the entire household. I want to know who's been in and out over the last 48 hours, he said. "And lock every door that doesn't need to be open." That night, David sat beside Ethan as the boy fed the smallest baby, now the quietest of the three. "I need to ask you something," David said gently. "Has anyone ever come looking for you and Abby? Before you met me?" Ethan nodded, fingers still working the bottle. "A man. He came by the trailer once, said he was from the city, but he didn't look like a social worker. He had this coat, long, dark. Abby told me to hide. Said if he asked, she'd tell him I was a cousin." David's jaw tensed. "Did he say what he wanted?" "He asked for the girl with the babies," Ethan replied. "She said he was lying, that he wasn't from the city." That changed everything. David leaned back, connecting dots that had until now floated separately. Whoever knocked on that door last night hadn't done so by chance. They knew where to go, and they knew what to ask for. This wasn't just about a runaway sister anymore. It was about those babies. Someone wanted them, someone dangerous. "Ethan, if you ever hear anything strange, you come to me first, understand?" The boy looked at him, unsure. "You promise you won't send us away?" David felt a lump rise in his throat. "I promise," he said, and he meant it, even if he didn't fully understand what he was protecting them from yet. Hours passed, and David found himself staring again at the photo of the Harper woman in the old party file. He brought it to a digital specialist for enhancement. The result came back quickly. A small scar, barely visible, traced her jawline, one similar to Ethan's. That confirmed it. They were blood, no more doubts. But what bothered David now was why this connection was hidden for so long, why no one told him, why the house records were sealed after her sudden departure. "She didn't quit," David whispered to himself. "She disappeared. Just like Abby, just like whoever brought those babies, and someone clearly wanted to make sure they stayed gone." That night, as snow began to fall again, David stood at the edge of his estate, near the tree line. A single pacifier lay half buried in the snow. Not one of the ones from his home. It had initials carved into the side, A.H. He turned it over in his hand, heart racing. Not Abby, not Harper. The name was different. Could it be a misdirect or a warning? The snow began to pick up, wind howling around him like the world was closing in. And David understood, more clearly than ever, the knock wasn't a mistake, it was a message, and whoever left it, they were coming back. The silence in the house had shifted. It was no longer just quiet, it was tense. The kind of silence that sits on the chest, pressing down with every hour that passes. David could feel it in the way the staff moved, quieter than usual. He saw it in Ethan, too, whose alertness had sharpened into something almost animalistic. The boy kept glancing at the windows, checking shadows, listening for sounds the others couldn't hear. David had spent the last 24 hours organizing quiet checks on the mansion's surveillance, rotating the security schedule, and conducting background reviews on every staff member. He didn't say it out loud, but they all knew. Someone had breached the safety of the house, and it wasn't random. By mid-morning, David decided to take action beyond his own resources. He sat down at his office desk and dialed a private contact inside Child Protective Services, someone he had helped fund in the past, someone he could trust, or so he thought. The woman on the other end of the call, Angela Green, listened carefully as David explained everything: the boy, the babies, the missing sister, the mysterious knock. There was a pause when he finished. Then her voice came through, cautious. "David, are you saying you've taken in 4 minors, undocumented, with no legal record, and you're choosing not to report it through official channels?" He hesitated, then replied, "I'm telling you, I believe something dangerous is happening, and if I go through the system, I might lose the only chance these kids have to stay alive." Another pause. Then she said something he didn't expect. "Let me make a call. Stay off grid. I'll find out what I can." David hung up with a mix of relief and dread. He had hoped for clarity, and instead, he'd been handed a riddle. Why had Angela not immediately insisted on intervention? Why had she spoken like she knew more than she could say? That same day, Ethan approached him carrying a blanket in one hand and a baby bottle in the other. "She's not coming back," he said flatly. "I don't feel her anymore." David didn't know what that meant, but he could see that Ethan wasn't just being pessimistic. He was grieving slowly, like someone peeling away the last layers of hope. Trying to distract him, David took Ethan into one of the unused wings of the mansion. "This used to be a studio," he said. "My sister painted here when she was your age." The room was dusty, covered in old canvases and furniture shrouded in sheets. Ethan ran his fingers across a table and said nothing. David opened a cabinet and pulled out some old sketchbooks. "You like to draw?" he asked. Ethan shrugged. "I used to. Abby said it kept me from getting too dark." David handed him a charcoal pencil. "Then draw what you're feeling." He didn't expect a miracle, but he hoped for a moment of release. Ethan took the pencil without a word and began to sketch on the back of a folded map. An hour later, David returned to find Ethan still drawing. The image was disturbing. It showed a woman with long hair, her face turned away, standing in front of 3 cribs. Behind her, a shadowy figure watched from a window. No face, just a suit. David asked, "Who is that?" Ethan stared at the image. "He was at the trailer once. Abby said never to talk to him." David took a photo of the drawing with his phone and sent it to his investigator. Moments later, the reply came in, "That silhouette matches a known associate of the Harlan Group. Private security, not government. Dangerous people." That name hit David like a cold wave. The Harlan Group was notorious in elite circles, officially a consulting firm, unofficially tied to hush operations, corporate suppression, and political scandals. He had heard whispers, but never crossed paths directly. What the hell were they doing near Ethan? Near Abby? And why babies? Suddenly, this wasn't just a protection issue. It was an operation, and the kids weren't just collateral, they were the center of it. He realized Angela's caution earlier made sense. If the Harlan Group was involved, going through official channels could trigger alerts that would bring more danger. That evening, David confronted one of his housekeepers, Maria, who had worked in the mansion for over a decade. "You used to work here during my father's time," he said. "Do you remember a woman named Catherine Harper?" Maria's face went pale. She looked down and crossed herself. "I remember," she said softly. She was kind, kept to herself, but she got scared. One day she came to work crying, said she saw something she shouldn't have. She quit the next morning. David pressed. "What did she see?" Maria hesitated. She wouldn't say, just that it was about a guest, a man in a long coat who came in without a name. The coincidence was too much to ignore. The timeline matched, the location, the fear. Everything Ethan had described echoed stories buried deep in the mansion's past. David now understood the truth he had avoided facing. His family's wealth wasn't clean. His father's reputation wasn't just polished, it was protected. And now that protection was unraveling. Ethan and those babies were the thread pulling it apart. And whoever was behind it wanted that thread cut. In a final attempt for answers, David called Angela again. This time, she answered on the first ring. "David," she said. "Quickly, listen to me. I made some calls. There's no record of an Abigail Harper in the National Foster System. No birth certificate for Ethan Harper. Nothing. But there's a match for the babies. They were all born at private clinics in different states, all under sealed records. That means someone powerful is involved." David's voice was low. "Can you help me?" Her reply was direct. "If you want to keep them safe, don't wait. Find out who brought them together, because someone else already is." David stood in the doorway of the nursery that night, watching Ethan rock one of the babies. With the same tired focus as always, he thought of everything he had learned, everything still unanswered. The questions no longer scared him, but the timing did. Whoever was behind this wouldn't wait forever. And David knew something else now. Something that changed everything. He wasn't protecting those children out of guilt anymore. He was protecting them because he finally understood this wasn't their fight, it was his. It was well after midnight when David found himself wandering the east wing of the mansion, an area he had rarely visited since inheriting the estate. Most of the rooms there had been shut for years, dust gathering over memories he never bothered to examine. But something Ethan had said earlier wouldn't leave his mind. During a quiet moment feeding one of the babies, the boy had pulled a small, rusted key from his coat pocket. "Abby told me if something ever happened, I'd know when to use this," he said. "I think it belongs to this house." David had studied the key, recognizing its vintage. Design handcrafted, not standard. He knew exactly what kind of lock it matched, and it led to one of the most avoided places in the mansion, his father's private study, sealed since the old man's death. The room had always been an enigma. Even as a child, David was told never to enter it. "Your father does important work in there," his mother had said once. No one questioned it. When David took over the house, the room remained locked. He assumed it was filled with old files or irrelevant documents. Now, with the key cold in his hand and Ethan's quiet trust hanging over him, David stood in front of the heavy oak door. He inserted the key. It turned with a reluctant click. The door creaked open, revealing a space frozen in time. The air was stale, the light from the hallway spilling in to reveal dust-covered furniture, bookcases lined with faded ledgers, and a massive desk with drawers. Built deep into the wall, it smelled like secrets. David stepped in, scanning the room. One painting stood out, a large oil canvas of a mountain landscape, perfectly centered. It was off, slightly tilted. When he removed it, he found a small compartment behind it, just large enough to hold a stack of files and a small black leather-bound notebook. Inside the notebook were names, addresses, and payment records. But not just any names. Some belonged to former staff, others to donors who had contributed large sums to his father's children's charity initiative. One page was flagged with a paperclip. On it, the name Catherine Harper was written, followed by a series of numbers and the phrase, "Hold, pending resolution." David's chest tightened. That word, resolution, it wasn't the language of charity. It was corporate, cold, strategic. He dug further, flipping through documents, until he found a scanned letter from a law firm marked confidential, describing a legal threat from a woman accusing a foundation board member of coercion, falsified employment records, and child endangerment. The letter was never sent. A sticky note on the page read, "Handled." Beneath the paperclip was a small photo, grainy but unmistakable. Catherine holding a baby standing beside a teenage girl. Abby, and next to them, a younger Ethan. It was undeniable now. They weren't strangers. They were embedded in the history of this house. David sat heavily in the old leather chair behind the desk. His hands trembled slightly as he processed the weight of what he'd just uncovered. His father had been involved in something far beyond philanthropy. There had been payments, quiet ones, likely to suppress voices. And Catherine Harper had tried to expose it, tried and failed. That's why that's vanished. Why Abby grew up in hiding. Why Ethan learned to survive in silence. His entire existence was shaped by a cover-up. And now the next generation, those three babies, were likely part of the same machinery. Manufactured silence, buried truths, legacy sins dressed as charity. Ethan entered the room without knocking. He stood in the doorway, clutching a blanket. "I heard you walking," he said. David gestured for him to come in. The boy looked around, cautious. "What is this place?" David didn't lie. "It was my father's study. It's been locked for years." Ethan walked slowly, taking in a room like a museum. His eyes landed on the photo still sitting on the desk. He picked it up, said nothing, but David saw his hands tighten around the frame. "That's her," Ethan whispered. "That's my mom." David leaned forward. "You remember her?" Ethan nodded slowly. "She used to sing when she cooked, always wore a blue apron. Abby missed her more than she ever said." There was something deeply surreal about the moment. David, heir to a fortune built on prestige, sitting beside a boy whose family had been entangled, perhaps destroyed, by that same legacy. "Ethan," David said. Voice steady. "Your mom tried to fight back. She left a record. She didn't just disappear." The boy didn't react right away. Then, with a quiet resolve, he asked, "What did they do to her?" David couldn't answer. Not yet. He didn't know. But he made a silent vow that he would find out. Every detail, every lie, and he would bring it all to light. Not just for Ethan, but because it was time. Long past time. They spent the next hour going through the contents of the hidden study together. Every document, every file, every coded message. David explained what he could, decoding the language of corruption that had once felt normal to him. Ethan listened, absorbing more than he let on. The boy was sharp, observant. "Why did your dad hide this?" he asked at one point. David sighed. "Because if the truth came out, everything he built would fall apart." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then let it fall." That simple sentence hit harder than anything else David had read all night. Let it fall. The boy wasn't just a survivor. He was a witness. And he wasn't afraid anymore. As dawn began to light the sky, David sealed the study again, this time taking the documents with him. He handed the notebook to Ethan. "This is yours," he said. "Your family's story starts here, and we're going to finish it together." Ethan looked down at the notebook, then up at David. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not trust, not yet, but something close, the beginning of it. Outside, the snow had started to melt. The house was still, but something had changed. Beneath the floorboards, in the walls, in the very bones of the mansion, truth had stirred, and there was no locking it away again. The following day unfolded like a quiet storm, slow, unsettling, and building towards something no one could name. David had barely slept. His mind churned with images of the files he'd uncovered, the photo of Catherine Harper holding her children, and the cryptic ledgers that suggested years of hidden transactions. But what disturbed him more than anything was how easily it all had remained buried. These weren't the errors of a corrupt official or a single unethical choice. This was a system, structured, protected, and perpetuated. And now, with Ethan and the babies under his roof, David realized that system might not be dormant, it might just be watching. By noon, David's private investigator arrived at the estate. A man named Roy Halston, discreet, methodical, with a background in tracking black market adoptions and corporate silencing operations. David handed him the notebook and gave him one order: find everything, especially what happened after Catherine disappeared. Roy nodded, flipping through the pages. "You're aware this is going to light some fires?" he asked. "Let them burn," David replied. Roy got to work immediately, calling in favors, accessing encrypted databases and cross-referencing names from the ledger. Hours passed, and each discovery made the picture clearer and darker. Catherine had filed an anonymous complaint through a non-profit whistleblower network years ago. The case had been dismissed for lack of evidence, but the name tagged in the complaint matched a senior advisor at the Harlan Group, the same group tied to the man who had visited Abby. David was no longer questioning coincidence. This was pattern, design. He stood in the living room, watching Ethan as the boy sat on the floor with the babies, humming softly while one of them clutched his thumb. The child looked fragile, yet was somehow stronger than any adult in that house. David couldn't help but feel a knot of shame in his chest. He had spent his life chasing influence, polishing a name inherited, not earned. Meanwhile, this boy had been quietly carrying the weight of an entire legacy of silence, betrayal, and loss, and no one had come for him. Until now. Roy returned that evening with a grim expression. "There's more," he said. "I found another name, Janice Thorne, former social worker. She disappeared 12 years ago after attempting to investigate. Inconsistencies in child placement records. Guess who signed her final employment clearance?" He held up a copy of a document. The signature was familiar. Charles Miller, David's father. David felt a shiver travel through his spine. "That's not the worst of it," Roy continued. "I found connections between your family's foundation and 4 other estates, high-profile ones. Each of them contributed to what was listed as a child transition fund. But none of those funds were ever publicly disclosed. No tax records, no reports." David rubbed his face, the pressure building in his skull. "So, you're saying this wasn't just my father?" Roy nodded. "No. It was a network, a loop of power, money, and control. And it didn't end with them. The babies Ethan is protecting? They might have been tagged for something much worse. Quiet placements, no paper trails, and no one to come looking." The horror of it settled deep into David's chest. This wasn't just about the past. It was about right now. Those children were alive, vulnerable, and likely being hunted, not for who they were, but for what they knew. Or worse, what they represented to the people who had built their fortunes on silence. That night, David sat with Ethan in the nursery. The boy was quiet, but his eyes were tired. "I talked to a man who's helping us learn more about your mom," David said. Ethan looked up slowly. "Did she try to stop them?" David nodded. "She tried, and she almost made it, but she needed more people to believe her. People like me." Ethan didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Are they still doing it?" David hesitated, then gave the truth. "I think they are. Or they want to." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then they won't stop until they get them," he said, motioning to the babies. David knew he was new. Right. In the following days, David ramped up the estate's security, infrared sensors, additional guards, vehicle checkpoints. But he also began drafting a legal disclosure. He knew the moment he went public, retaliation would follow. His assets, his reputation, everything could be destroyed. But he no longer cared. He had wealth enough to walk away from. What mattered now was what had been hidden beneath it all. He scheduled a private meeting with 3 former board members of the foundation, hoping to uncover more from those who might have been complicit or scared into silence. Only one showed up. Eleanor Price, a woman in her 60s, sharp-eyed and calm. "I thought you'd come eventually," she said. In that meeting, Eleanor confirmed David's worst fears. "Your father didn't create the system. He inherited it, but he perfected it," she explained. "Children with no records, women too scared to speak, money laundering through orphan initiatives. The goal wasn't trafficking in the traditional sense. It was obedience, creating silence, controlling futures." David stared in disbelief. "And no one stopped it?" Eleanor looked down. "Some tried, but power has gravity. People get pulled into it or crushed by it." Before she left, she handed David a folder. Inside was a list of names, many he didn't recognize, some he did. All of them were still alive, still in play. The past wasn't over. It was active, alive and angry. Back at the estate, as David absorbed the weight of Eleanor's confession, Ethan appeared at his office door, holding the baby girl in his arms. "She won't sleep without hearing the story," he said. David smiled sadly. "What story?" Ethan looked down at her and replied, "The one where no one leaves this time." That sentence hit David with more force than anything else that week, because deep down, it was the story he needed to tell too. Not just for them, but for himself. No more leaving, no more silence. This was war now. And for once in his life, David Miller knew exactly what he was fighting for. David sat in the dim light of his study, the air thick with tension. The folder Eleanor Price had left him rested open on the table, its contents spread out like a battlefield map. Each name scribbled inside wasn't just a line of text. They were complicit. They had signed off, turned their backs, or actively participated in a system designed to bury lives. What twisted his stomach most was the realization that many of them were familiar. Dinner guests, business partners, people he'd toasted champagne with. And as the list grew, so did the shadows it cast over his past. These weren't strangers. They were collaborators. The rot had been in the room all along. He scanned further down the list and froze at one particular name: Jonathan Kessler, a man who had served as his father's personal legal advisor for decades, but also someone David had come to rely on after his father's passing. Kessler had helped restructure the family estate. He handled sensitive documents. He'd been in this very room countless times. David felt bile rise in his throat. Kessler wasn't just an associate. He was a gatekeeper, someone who had seen the files, known the names, and kept the door shut. If anyone could explain how all of this had stayed buried, it was him. And now David knew he couldn't be trusted. That evening, David invited Kessler over under the guise of discussing trust fund logistics. The man arrived as expected, polished and punctual, briefcase in hand. He walked through the house like he belonged there, offering pleasantries, complimenting the decor, completely unaware that the man sitting across from him no longer saw him as an ally. "We need to review the documents in the Harper file," David said, voice calm but direct. Kessler blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" David handed him a copy of the photo. "Catherine, Abby, and Ethan. You've seen her before, don't lie." Kessler looked at it, paused, then said, "I don't recall this particular—" "Don't!" David snapped. "I've read the files. I know what you buried. I want to know why." For a moment, Kessler's mask cracked. He shifted in his chair, placed the photo down, and let out a breath. Charles made choices to protect his name, we all did. But not everything was what it seemed. David leaned forward. Children, John. Babies. My father didn't just mismanage a foundation. He enabled something that destroyed families. Kessler hesitated. You think I wanted this? You think I had power to stop it? I was told to look the other way, so I did. Because I had a family, a future to protect. The room went cold. David stood, rage simmering just beneath the surface. So you stayed silent. You let it happen. And you watched. Kessler rose slowly, his face unreadable now. You think exposing this will fix anything? You'll burn everything, your legacy, your name, the estate. No one wins. David walked to the door and opened it. Then let it burn. Kessler didn't speak another word. He picked up his briefcase and walked out. The door closed behind him with a thud that echoed down the hall. David stood there, hands still on the knob, breathing hard. That was it, the moment of no return. He had confronted the truth, and the truth had looked him in the eye and dared him to stay quiet. He had chosen war. That night, he found Ethan in the hallway, looking out the window at the snow-covered grounds. Someone was out there, the boy said without turning. David followed his gaze. When? Earlier. A flashlight. Just one flicker. Then it was gone. David nodded, his jaw tightening. The threat wasn't theoretical anymore. It was close. He'd stirred the nest, and now they were circling. But he wouldn't back down. We're not leaving, he said. Ethan turned to him. Even if it gets worse. David crouched to his level. Especially if it gets worse. The boy nodded. For the first time, he seemed to believe it. David met with Roy again early the next morning. We need to move fast, he said. If they know we're close, they'll try to erase everything. Roy handed him a flash drive. I've copied every record we could find, and we found something else. Abby filed a report 3 weeks ago under a false name. She said she was being followed. She named one of the clinics, said 3 babies had been trafficked across state lines. David felt like the air had been knocked out of him. So she knew. She tried to stop it. Roy nodded. And she may still be alive, but she's in hiding. Or, worse, being held. David didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. He sat in the nursery, surrounded by the soft breathing of the babies and the quiet presence of Ethan, who lay curled on the couch. Everything felt fragile, like the world outside that door was sharpening its teeth. But David wasn't afraid anymore, not for himself. He looked at those children and knew this wasn't about guilt or redemption. This was about justice, about truth, and about ensuring that the silence which had swallowed Catherine and maybe Abby wouldn't swallow them too. He made a decision then, the kind that would change everything. Tomorrow he would go public, with the names, the documents, the recordings, all of it. He would tear the foundation apart brick by brick and name every board member who helped build it. Let the world see. Let them know what power had hidden in plain sight. If his family name was going to mean anything at all, it would start now, with truth, with fire, with no one left in the dark. The snowstorm hit harder than expected, sharp, fast, and without mercy. It rolled in before dawn, swallowing the estate in a whiteout. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and even the outer motion sensors failed under the constant interference. But David Miller wasn't thinking about the weather. He was standing in the main hall of the mansion, eyes locked on the massive TV mounted above the fireplace. A live stream was counting down, 30 minutes until it went live. Until everything he had uncovered, the documents, the testimony, the names, would be broadcast to the world. The decision had been made. There was no going back. This wasn't just exposure, it was a declaration of war. Ethan stood nearby, holding the smallest of the babies, who had grown more responsive over the past few days. She gripped his hoodie tightly, her face pressed into his shoulder. David watched the boy with a quiet awe. In the middle of all this chaos, he had become an anchor, not just for the children, but for David himself. "Once this goes out," David said softly, "we won't be safe anymore." Ethan didn't flinch. "We already weren't." The words hit like truth always does, simple, brutal, and impossible to deny. David reached into his pocket and handed Ethan a small earpiece. "Stay in the nursery. Lock the door behind you. If I say now, you run to the panic room." Ethan nodded. He didn't ask questions. He understood more than most adults would. Roy arrived 10 minutes later, breathless and pale. "We've got movement," he said, showing David the live drone feed. A black SUV had breached the far gate and was advancing fast through the blizzard. 2 men, tactical gear, face masks. They cut the cameras with an EMP burst. They know exactly where they're going. David didn't hesitate. "We stick to the plan." He activated the house lockdown, triggering steel-reinforced shutters on all ground-floor windows. The nursery was secured. Staff were evacuated. The rest of the estate was dark, quiet, ready. David slipped on the mic attached to the laptop running the live stream. 5 minutes to go. The bar desk. First breach came from the east wing. Glass shattered from the rooftop skylight. David and Roy took positions behind the entry corridor, flashlights off, firearms ready. David wasn't a soldier, but this was his war now. The intruders moved fast, like they'd been inside before. They weren't here for valuables. They were here for people, for silence. Roy fired a warning shot when one of them passed the hallway, grazing the wall near the man's head. The intruder ducked, returned fire, but didn't aim to kill. They were trying to disable, capture. David's adrenaline surged. He shouted into the comm, "They're in! Ethan, get ready!" In the nursery, Ethan grabbed the other 2 babies, one on each arm, and ran as fast as his small legs could carry him. The panic room was behind the built-in bookshelf in the master suite, a room David had shown him days earlier. As Ethan reached it, he heard movement. Down the hallway, fast, heavy boots. He ducked into the room, activated the lock, and held his breath. Inside, the soundproof walls swallowed the chaos outside. The babies whimpered, but he shushed them gently, pressing his body over theirs like a human shield. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. Back in the main hall, David and Roy were pinned behind the staircase. One of the attackers tried to flank them, but slipped on the polished floor, giving Roy an opening. A clean hit to the leg dropped the man. He screamed in pain, dropping his weapon. The other froze, then reached for a smoke canister, tossing it into the center of the room, the house filled with gray mist. "You still want to do this?" Roy asked between coughs. "More than ever," David replied. He grabbed the laptop and dashed toward the dining room, where a secondary router was protected from the EMP. He had 60 seconds left. The live stream began. Despite the smoke, the low-resolution camera activated, and David's face appeared on screen, cut, bloody, but determined. "My name is David Miller," he began, "and I've spent the last few weeks uncovering a network of silence that stretches across estates, corporations, and foundations, including my own." As he spoke, images began flashing behind him. Catherine Harper's photo, documents with falsified adoption records, financial ledgers linking the Harlan Group to multiple private clinics. They took mothers, they took children, and they told us to stay quiet. I won't. The feed streamed live across multiple platforms, pre-scheduled to auto-upload from servers around the world. The attackers fled when they realized what was happening. One of them bolted through the shattered back door, disappearing into the snow. The other limped away with Roy in pursuit, but David didn't care. The real strike had already landed, not with bullets but with truth. In the panic room, Ethan's earpiece buzzed. David's voice, calm and steady, said, "It's over. You're safe." Ethan looked at the babies, then up at the security cam, blinking green. He smiled not because the danger was the gone, but because for the first time someone had kept a promise. Later that night, when the blizzard began to ease, police arrived. But they were too late. The broadcast had already gone viral. Journalists called non-stop. Activists reached out. Politicians fumbled their statements. David gave no comment. Not yet. He stood by the window, watching the snowfall, letting the weight of what had happened settle into his bones. They had come to kill silence. But silence had screamed. In that frozen night, with the world watching, David Miller, once just a billionaire, became something else. Father, a fighter, a man who had lost everything that didn't matter and found everything that did. Morning came slowly after the storm, as if even the sun was hesitant to rise over the remnants of what had unfolded the night before. The snow had stopped, but it hadn't melted. Thick drifts still covered the grounds, swallowing footprints, broken glass, and bloodstains alike. Inside the mansion, silence returned, but it was different now. Not fearful or heavy. It was a silence that held its breath because something had shifted. Not just in the air, but in the foundation of everything that had once seemed untouchable. The truth was out. The broadcast had reached millions, and nothing would ever be the same. David stood in the nursery, watching Ethan gently rock the youngest of the babies, the girl with the quietest cry. She no longer whimpered at every sound. Her tiny hands clutched his hoodie like she belonged there, and maybe she did. Ethan, no longer a lost boy in the snow, had found something even he didn't know he needed, a place where his presence mattered. David sat beside him, not speaking, just breathing it in. The calm, the recovery, the small, almost invisible shift in energy that told him the storm inside Ethan had also begun to settle. There were still questions, still scars, but now there was also space for healing. The news had erupted in every major outlet. Investigations were already underway. The Harlan Group's offices were raided in 3 cities. Anonymous tips flooded hotlines. David received dozens of legal threats and offers. Politicians reached out, asking for meetings. Non-profits begged for collaboration, but he answered none of them. Not yet. For now, his focus was narrow. Protect the children, locate Abby, and rebuild the broken bridges that had brought him to this moment. Roy remained on site, organizing round-the-clock surveillance while tracking every lead. "She's out there," he'd said that morning, holding up a blurry still of what might have been Abby captured on a highway camera. David just nodded. That was enough to keep going. He spent part of the day meeting with a family law attorney. Not one of the powerful names he used to work with, but a quiet, independent woman who had fought for underrepresented youth for 2 decades. "What are you looking to do?" she asked. David looked her dead in the eye. "Adopt all 4. Permanently." The woman blinked. "You're aware of the challenges here. Multiple states, missing, documentation, cross-border issues." "I don't care," David interrupted. "Make it happen." And he meant it. He wasn't asking out of obligation or guilt. This wasn't about fixing his name. It was about finally doing what no one else had done for these children, choosing them. Later that night, the staff prepared a quiet dinner. The mansion was warm again, not just from the fire, but from the way it felt lived in. Toys scattered across the living room, bottles stacked near the sink, a crib set up near David's bedroom. Life had taken root, imperfect, messy, loud, but alive. Ethan insisted on helping set the table, careful not to disturb the babies napping nearby. David watched him fold napkins with a seriousness that didn't match his age, then smile softly when one of the babies stirred in her sleep. That smile said more than any conversation they'd had. He was still carrying the weight of everything. But now he wasn't carrying it alone. Before bed, Ethan stood by the window, watching the last snowflakes drift across the night. David joined him, holding a warm bottle in one hand, a blanket in the other. "Do you think she knows?" Ethan asked. "That we're okay?" David didn't hesitate. "She knows, and when we find her, you'll tell her yourself." Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving the glass. "I used to dream she'd come back, knock on the door and just be there." David placed a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes people leave so we can find a new way back to them." The boy didn't reply, but he didn't pull away either. That night, David wrote a letter, not for lawyers or the press or the world. It was addressed to Catherine Harper. He didn't know if anyone would ever read it, but he needed to say it. "You tried, you fought, you mattered, and your children are safe. Now, I promise you the silence ends with me." He folded it and placed it in the drawer of his father's desk, right where the old notebook used to be. A replacement not for history, but for truth and for peace. At sunrise, David walked the babies out onto the back terrace, bundled tightly in blankets. Ethan stood beside him, silent but steady. Below them, the ground sparkled with fresh snow, but the sky above was clear for the first time in days. He looked down at the children, no longer symbols of a hidden past, but carriers of a new beginning. He didn't know what would come next. Investigations, trials, possibly danger. But for now, there was only one truth he needed to hold on to. They were safe. They were home. And he wasn't letting go. She had left him with nothing but a key and a promise. And somehow, through the cold, the blood and the lies, that promise had survived. He never thought he'd become a father. But then again, some families aren't made by blood. They're made by snow, by fire, and by choosing to stay. Hi, I'm Erlen, and I hope this story moved you as much as it moved me. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button, leave a comment telling me what you felt, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional and powerful stories like this one. Also, share this with someone who would love to watch a story that proves family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about who stays. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.